Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End, by Atul Gawande. Picture this, a man named Ivan Ilyich, living what most of us would call the dream life. He's a successful judge, sharp as a tack, the kind of guy who always knows which fork to use at dinner parties. His whole world revolves around climbing the career ladder, impressing the right people, and enjoying the comfortable rhythm of a well-ordered existence. Then, one ordinary afternoon, everything changes. He's hanging curtains, loses his balance on a stepladder, and takes a tumble. Nothing dramatic, just an awkward fall. But there's this pain in his side that won't quit. Days turn into weeks, and instead of fading, the pain grows sharper. Soon, this once vibrant man can barely make it through his workday. His friends, who used to fill his study with laughter and cigars, suddenly have urgent appointments elsewhere. His family tiptoes around him, their discomfort hanging in the air like a bad smell. Doctors parade through his bedroom, each one more expensive than the last, prescribing treatments that accomplish exactly nothing. But here's what really breaks even. It's not the physical agony, it's the charade everyone insists on performing. The elaborate pretense that he's merely under the weather, that he'll be back to normal any day now. Just follow doctor's orders, keep your chin up, and everything will work out fine. Nobody will speak the obvious truth, staring them all in the face. So Ivan suffers in profound isolation, desperate for someone to simply acknowledge his reality, to comfort him the way you'd comfort a frightened child. But he's an important man with a distinguished gray beard, and such tenderness seems impossibly out of reach. This story, penned by Leo Tolstoy more than 100 years ago, turns out to be the perfect key to unlock one of the most important books of our generation, Being Mortal, by Dr. Atul Gawande. Gawande is a surgeon working in one of the world's most technologically advanced hospitals. Everything in his training, everything in his career, boils down to one fundamental mission: save lives. Fix what's broken in the human body. But standing in that operating room year after year, something began nagging at him. A disturbing realization crept in. He and the entire machinery of modern medicine had become incredibly sophisticated at fighting death, but they knew almost nothing about helping people truly live when that fight couldn't be won anymore. This book chronicles his quest to understand what medicine, in its single-minded pursuit of keeping hearts beating, has completely forgotten. It's a journey that sweeps from bustling Indian villages to the sterile, silent corridors of American nursing homes. You'll meet rebels who are completely reimagining how we care for the aging and the frail, and you'll be forced to wrestle with the hardest questions any of us will ever face. By the time we're done here, you'll grasp a profound truth that modern medicine has somehow misplaced: how to live meaningfully all the way to the very end. And you'll discover that the answer isn't about fighting harder or finding better weapons. It's about asking completely different questions. Questions about what makes life worth living in the first place. Dr. Gawande's journey begins with a memory from his early days as a surgical resident, a story about a man named Joseph Lazaroff. In his 60s, Lazaroff was battling an aggressive, incurable prostate cancer that had spread throughout his body, eventually attacking his spine and leaving him partially paralyzed. The neurosurgeon laid out two paths: comfort care or an incredibly dangerous surgery to carve the tumor out of his spine. Just to be clear, this operation wouldn't cure anything. It wouldn't give him back the use of his legs. At best, it might slow things down for a few months. But the risks? Enormous. They'd have to crack open his chest, collapse one of his lungs, and there was a very real chance the procedure itself would kill him faster than the cancer would. Lazaroff's son hesitated, reminding his father of conversations they'd had, how he'd always said he never wanted to end up on machines in an intensive care unit. But Lazaroff was adamant. "Don't you give up on me," he insisted. "You give me every chance I've got." So they rolled him into surgery. Technically speaking, the operation was a success. The surgeons removed the tumor. But Joseph Lazaroff never came back from it. Complication after complication ravaged his body in the ICU. His lungs failed. Infections took hold. Blood clots formed. After 2 weeks of watching their father suffer through this nightmare, his son finally told the doctors to stop. The job of removing the breathing tube fell to the young Dr. Gawande. He turned up the morphine drip, whispered a few words just in case Lazaroff could still hear him, and pulled the tube. A few struggling breaths, then nothing. Years later, what haunted Gawande wasn't simply that Lazaroff had made the wrong choice. It was that every single doctor involved had failed to have an honest conversation with him. Sure, they were experts at rattling off statistics about surgical complications, but not once did they talk about the bigger picture of his disease. Not once did they ask what mattered most to him as his life was drawing to a close. They just kept offering another treatment, another sliver of hope that something good might happen. In their attempt to do everything possible, they'd actually done nothing to help him live well with the time he had left. Instead, they'd delivered a prolonged and agonizing death. This is when it hit Gawande. This is the central crisis of modern medicine. Our scientific breakthroughs have revolutionized human existence. People are living longer and healthier lives than at any point in history. But in achieving this miracle, we've transformed aging and dying into medical events, managed by professionals in hospitals and institutions, and we've proven shockingly unprepared for the consequences. Think about this. As recently as 1945, most people died at home. By the 1980s, only 17% did. The final act of life has moved behind closed doors, into facilities, becoming something foreign and distant to most of us. We've turned mortality into a medical problem, and in doing so, we've lost something essential about what it means to be human. To understand what's been lost, Gawande takes us into two radically different worlds, embodied by two very different grandparents. First, there's his grandfather, Sitaram Gawande, who experienced old age the traditional way in a small Indian village. At over 100 years old, Sitaram was fragile. His hearing was shot, he needed a cane to get around, and he required help with basic daily tasks. By American standards, he would have been classified as lacking the capacity for independent living and shipped off to a nursing home. But in his village, none of that mattered. He lived surrounded by family, honored not despite his age but because of it. Family members sought his wisdom on important decisions. His life had meaning. Even past his 100th birthday, he insisted on riding out to inspect his farm every evening. His family worried he might take a bad fall, but they understood the importance of this ritual to him. So they found him a smaller, gentler horse, and made sure someone always rode alongside him. His wishes shaped his life, and the family's job was simply to make those wishes possible. Now contrast that with Alice Hobson, Gawande's wife's grandmother. Alice was the perfect embodiment of the modern ideal, the fiercely independent individual. Widowed at 56, she lived alone in her Virginia house for decades. She mowed her own lawn, fixed her own pipes, drove her big Chevy Impala, and even delivered meals to other people she considered more needy than herself. Any suggestion that she might need assistance was met with bristling resistance. Her life belonged to her, and she was in complete command of it. For most of human history, Sitaram's experience was normal. The elderly lived within multi-generational families. But our world has shifted dramatically. We celebrate independence. Young people moved away from farms and villages for education and opportunity. Gawande's own father left his Indian village to become a doctor in Ohio. This transformation wasn't tragic. It was actually liberating. It gave both young and old more freedom and control over their destinies. The veneration of elders gave way to the veneration of the independent self. There's just one rather significant problem with building your life around independence. Sooner or later, independence becomes impossible. Serious illness or frailty will arrive. It's as inevitable as the sun setting. And then a new, urgent question emerges. If independence is our entire purpose, what happens when we can no longer sustain it? This question came for Alice at 84. She was in remarkable shape for her age, but then small cracks began appearing. A moment of confusion during a family vacation. A couple of falls down the basement stairs that she tried to hide. A car accident where she hit the gas instead of the brake, sending her Impala careening through a neighbor's yard, demolishing their fence and garden. The final straw came when two men she'd hired for yard work intimidated her into handing over thousands of dollars. The incident left her shaken and exposed just how vulnerable she'd become. It was clear she could no longer safely live alone. So the family did what modern families do. They found her a spot in a beautiful, highly rated senior living complex called Longwood House. It offered a continuum of care, everything from independent living apartments to a full-service nursing home wing. On paper, it seemed perfect, a way to keep her comfortable while ensuring her safety. But it wasn't a solution for Alice. When Gawande visited her a few weeks after the move, something fundamental had changed. The spark in her eyes had died. She had a kitchen, but stopped cooking. She avoided the group activities. She withdrew into herself, visibly miserable. She couldn't quite articulate why, but her most frequent complaint echoed what you hear in nursing homes everywhere. It just isn't home. Longwood House was safe. It was clean. It was professionally run. But it wasn't home. Home is the place where your priorities matter most, where your preferences dictate how you spend your days. At Longwood House, Alice's life was no longer hers. Aides monitored what she ate. Nurses tracked her health. They noticed her growing unsteadiness and insisted she use a walker. When she started forgetting her medications, they informed her she'd have to move to the nursing wing unless she allowed them to supervise her pill-taking. Her apartment might have been labeled independent living, but for Alice, it felt like she'd been locked up for the crime of growing old. How did we create a system where the only option seemed to be dangerous independence at home or soul-crushing despair in an institution? Gawande explains that the modern nursing home was never actually designed with the elderly in mind. It was designed to solve a problem for hospitals. As medicine became more powerful in the mid-20th century, hospitals transformed from dreaded places of last resort into centers of healing and cure. But they quickly began filling up with patients who couldn't be cured, the chronically ill, and the frail elderly who had nowhere else to go. The solution was to construct separate, custodial units to free up those expensive hospital beds. They called them nursing homes because they borrowed the hospital model. Their priorities were medical, safety, hygiene, efficiency. The notion of creating a place where people could actually live meaningful lives never entered the equation. This is what sociologist Irving Goffman called a total institution, a place, like a prison or military base, where every aspect of life happens in the same location, under the same central authority, according to a rigid schedule. The objective becomes managing the mechanics of care, not fulfilling the desires and needs of the person receiving that care. The result is an ongoing power struggle. Residents who resist the schedule, who refuse medications or try to sneak a cookie, get labeled feisty or difficult. We've built a system that prioritizes safety above everything else. forgetting that a life worth living requires more than just being safe. It requires purpose, autonomy, and a reason to get out of bed in the morning. For Alice, losing control was a slow, crushing defeat. After a bad fall shattered her hip, she was moved permanently to the nursing home wing. Her privacy vanished. Her days became dictated by institutional routines. One afternoon, she leaned close to her son and whispered just 2 words. "I'm ready." She was ready to die. A few months later, after developing internal bleeding, she made a choice. She didn't press her call button. They found her the next morning, having passed away quietly, on her own terms, in the only way she had left. Alice's story is a tragedy, but it's a quiet one, playing out millions of times over across the country. It forces us to ask, is this really the best we can do? The answer, Gawande discovers, is absolutely not. There are pioneers out there, hidden in plain sight, who are building something better. One of them is a woman named Karen Brown Wilson. Wilson's journey began with her own mother, Jessie. At just 55, Jessie suffered a devastating stroke that paralyzed one side of her body. She needed constant assistance, and with no other viable options, she ended up in a nursing home. For years afterward, she pleaded with her daughter, "Take me home. Get me out of here." Her mother's vision for a better life was remarkably simple. She wanted a small apartment with a little kitchen and bathroom, a place for her cat, her books, her favorite Vicks VapoRub, a place with her own front door and lock, where she could control the thermostat and keep her own furniture, a place where she'd be a person in her own home, not a patient in a hospital bed. This vision, so simple yet so revolutionary, became Wilson's life's work. She and her husband sketched out plans for a new kind of elderly housing, one that would provide necessary assistance without stripping away autonomy. When nobody would build it, they built it themselves. In 1983, they opened Park Place, the first assisted living facility. The concept was radical. The people living there weren't called patients, they were tenants. They had private apartments with kitchens and doors that locked. They could have pets. They controlled their own schedules, chose their own meals, ran their own lives. The care providers understood they were guests in someone else's home, and that shifted the entire power dynamic. The goal was simple. Nobody should ever have to feel institutionalized again. Around the same time, another pioneer, a young doctor named Bill Thomas, was confronting the soul-deadening nature of nursing homes from the inside. As the new medical director of Chase Memorial Nursing Home, he was depressed by the pervasive despair he witnessed. He came to believe the residents were suffering from what he called the 3 plagues of institutional life: boredom, loneliness, and helplessness. His solution was as crazy as it was inspired. He decided to fill the nursing home with life itself. And he didn't ease into it. He called his approach the Big Bang. He brought in 2 dogs, 4 cats, a colony of rabbits, a flock of hens, and hundreds of indoor plants. And then, just to make things interesting, 100 parakeets, all delivered on the same day before the cages had even arrived. They released them into the beauty salon, and for a few glorious hours it was absolute, wonderful chaos. But something magical happened. The residents, many of whom had been withdrawn and non-responsive for months, began waking up. They adopted the birds, gave them names, provided daily reports on their well-being. People who hadn't spoken in months started conversations. People who hadn't walked in ages started asking to take the dogs outside. The results were stunning. Within 2 years, the total number of prescriptions per resident dropped by half. The use of psychoactive drugs for agitation plummeted. And here's the kicker. The death rate fell by 15%. Thomas realized he'd stumbled onto something profound. He wasn't just fighting boredom, he was giving people a reason to live. By giving them something to care for, a plant, a bird, a dog, he'd given them back a sense of purpose. What pioneers like Wilson and Thomas understood is that we have purposes that extend beyond ourselves. Our lives aren't just collections of moments, they're stories. And what matters in the end is having the chance to be the author of your own story, to shape its final chapters in a way that's consistent with your character and your deepest loyalties. This insight, Gawande realizes, applies not just to aging, but to how we confront any serious illness. Which brings us to the most difficult part of this journey, the hard conversations about the end of life. Here we meet Sarah Monopoly. At 34, pregnant with her first child, she received a devastating diagnosis: terminal, stage 4 lung cancer. Sarah and her husband Rich decided they wanted to aggressively manage the disease. They didn't want to talk about statistics or prognoses. They wanted to talk about treatment options. And so began a brutal downward spiral. One round of chemotherapy failed, then another, then another. Each treatment brought debilitating side effects, draining her strength and stealing her time. Her doctors, including Gawande himself, who was consulted about a second, unrelated cancer, found themselves caught up in her optimism. It was easier to discuss the fantasy of some new experimental drug than to confront the reality unfolding before their eyes. We all hope for the miracle, for that slim chance of being on the long tail of the survival curve, and so hope becomes the plan. But as Gawande writes, hope is not a plan. When the end came for Sarah, it wasn't the peaceful death at home she'd imagined. It came after a frantic 911 call, a rush to the hospital, and a final, desperate struggle for breath in an intensive care unit. The system, with its default setting to always do something, had taken over completely. But there's another way. It's called palliative care, or hospice. And it represents a fundamental shift in what we're trying to achieve. The goal is no longer fighting for more time at any cost. The goal is fighting for the best possible quality of whatever time remains. It's not about surrendering. It's about focusing on what truly matters: freedom from pain, being with loved ones, maintaining awareness, living with purpose. Studies have revealed something startling. Patients with terminal cancer who have early, honest conversations with their doctors about end-of-life preferences are not only less likely to end up on a ventilator in an ICU, they suffer less, maintain their capabilities longer, and their families suffer less grief afterward. One landmark study found that lung cancer patients who received palliative care alongside standard treatment didn't just have a better quality of life, they actually live 25% longer. The lesson, Gawande says, is almost Zen-like. You live longer only when you stop trying to live longer at all costs. The key is the conversation itself. It's not about checking boxes on a form. It's an ongoing process. It's about doctors taking time to ask a few simple but profound questions. What's your understanding of your situation? What are your biggest fears? What are your hopes? What trade-offs are you willing to make for the possibility of more time? And which trade-offs are you absolutely not willing to make? And finally, what course of action best serves this understanding? This is the conversation Gawande finally learns to have, not just as a physician but as a son. The book's final and most powerful story is about his own father. Dr. Atmaram Gawande was a vibrant, healthy surgeon in his 70s when doctors found a massive, inoperable tumor growing inside his spinal cord. The family consulted two top neurosurgeons. The first was dismissive and paternalistic, insisting on immediate, aggressive surgery. The second, Dr. Benzel, was different. He took time to listen. He understood that the elder Dr. Gawande's greatest fear wasn't the tumor itself, but the surgery, specifically, the risk of being left paralyzed, unable to continue the work that gave his life meaning. Benzel didn't act like a commander issuing orders. He was a counselor, helping guide the decision in line with his patient's priorities. They decided to wait. For almost 4 years, the elder Dr. Gawande lived fully. He retired from surgery but threw himself into his work as a Rotary District governor. He redefined what gave his life purpose. But eventually, inevitably, the tumor progressed. He began losing strength in his arms and legs. Falls became more frequent. One evening, Gawande sat down with his parents for the hard conversation. He asked his father the questions that really mattered. What were his deepest fears? He feared becoming a burden, needing total care from others. What trade-offs was he willing to make? He said that just being able to eat chocolate ice cream and watch television wasn't a life he was willing to endure a lot of suffering to maintain. He wanted to interact with people, to maintain some control over his world. He'd rather die than be completely paralyzed and dependent on a ventilator. This clarity gave them their roadmap. They opted for the risky surgery, knowing it was the last chance to preserve the life he valued. The surgery was partially successful, but the tumor was relentless. Radiation failed, leaving him weaker. Chemotherapy offered only the tiniest sliver of hope, paired with immense suffering. After another fall left him paralyzed on his bedroom floor for hours, unable to get up, he cried out to his son, "I'm so scared I can't do this. I want to die rather than go through this." This was the turning point. They called hospice. The nurse who arrived didn't talk about fighting disease. She talked about managing pain, about his goals, about his desire to feel happy. With their help, his slide into complete quadriplegia halted. He stopped falling. He began hosting small parties again. He discovered that even in the narrow space his tumor had left him, there was still room to truly live. His final days weren't easy. There was suffering. There was fear. There were agonizing family debates about whether to give him the morphine that would bring peace but take away his consciousness. But, through it all, his story remained his own. When he woke from his medication-induced fog, he didn't want to discuss symptoms. He wanted to see pictures of his grandchildren. He wanted to taste the foods from his childhood. He wanted to be at peace. And in the end, he was. He passed away at home, surrounded by family, his wishes honored. In the end, Being Mortal isn't really a book about dying. It's a book about living. It's a profound and profoundly necessary argument that the ultimate goal of medicine, and indeed of our entire lives, isn't merely survival, but well-being. The goal is enabling people to live with purpose and meaning, all the way to the very end. For centuries we had an art of dying, an ars moriendi. It was a collection of rituals and customs that helped people face their final chapter with a sense of peace and completion. Our technological society has forgotten this art. We've traded a dying role for a fighting role, and we've paid a terrible price. We inflict suffering at the end of people's lives and remain somehow oblivious to the harm we've caused. The most powerful lesson from this book isn't just for doctors or policymakers, it's for all of us. It's the lesson that we need the courage to have these conversations. The courage to confront the reality of our own mortality and the mortality of the people we love. This isn't about abandoning hope. It's about redefining what hope means. For so long, hope has been about the miracle cure, the lottery ticket, the Hail Mary pass. But Gawande shows us another kind of hope entirely, the hope for a good day, the hope for a meaningful conversation, the hope for a moment of genuine connection, the hope for a life whose final chapters are just as rich and purposeful as the opening ones. So what can we actually do with this knowledge? First, start the conversation. Talk to your parents, your grandparents, the people you love. You don't have to wait for a crisis to strike. Ask them those simple but powerful questions. What are your fears for the future? What are your hopes? What matters most to you? And just as importantly, really listen to their answers. This conversation is the greatest gift you can give them. Second, think about your own answers to these questions. What would make your life worth living if your time was running short? What trade-offs would you be willing to make? And which ones would you absolutely refuse? Knowing your own priorities is the first step toward ensuring your story ends on your terms. And third, reconsider what you think you know about concepts like palliative care and hospice. Understand that they're not about surrendering or giving up. They're about empowering people to live their fullest possible lives, right now, in this moment. That was a summary of Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. We've touched on the most powerful stories and ideas today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is like looking at a photograph of an incredible meal. You can see what's in it, but you can't taste it. The real power of this book is in those quiet moments when Gawande's prose and the humanity of his subjects connect with you in ways you didn't expect. This summary is a map, but the book itself is the actual journey. If anything we've talked about today has resonated with you, I really encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just learning. It's an experience that can genuinely transform how you see your life, your family, and what it means to be human. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable and want to continue exploring the ideas that have shaped the most successful and wisest minds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next journey into another life-changing book. Let's keep growing together.